Hello class, this is Mr. Ensminger, and what we're going to be covering in this lesson is Lesson 15, Contemporary America, the Cold War to Watergate. And what we have here is the moon landing in 1969, July of 1969. Post-war prosperity in the 1950s. The end of World War II in 1945 left America with a much larger federal government and in a position as world leader, which we dealt with at the end of World War II in the lessons leading up to the Cold War. The era also left the Soviet Union in a position to spread its political and economic system of communism and socialism, and obviously their sphere of influence. Harry S. Truman was re-elected in a close race against Republican Thomas Dewey, governor of New York, in 1948. Truman desegregated the United States military and oversaw the American military action in the Korean War, which we covered during the Cold War era. China and North Korea became communist after the war ended, and in 1950 North Korea invaded South Korea, which sparked the beginning of the Korean War. War hero Dwight D. Eisenhower became president for 2 terms from 1953 to 1961. He was a Cold War combatant, most remembered for his massive retaliation program in the fear that nuclear war would be potentially waged with the Soviet Union. Was the father of the American interstate system, but he did very little to push for civil rights, nor did he do much for the rights of farmers in the post-World War II era. Here we have an iconic image of Harry S. Truman holding up the Chicago Daily Tribune, "Dewey defeats Truman." And here on the left we have Harry S. Truman, and on the right, President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Korea and the Cold War. The United States and the United Nations sent troops to help South Korea defend itself after the invasion of North Korea in 1950. It was the first major hotspot of the Cold War in the post-World War II era. One aspect of the struggle surfaced in a scare that communists secretly held positions in the United States government. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin created a climate of fear and suspicion for several years with such claims. The term McCarthyism grew to describe his tactics of making accusations against suspected communists who weren't really communists, and we talked at length about that in our previous lesson, that it destroyed the lives and careers of a number of Americans who were falsely accused of being communist. Here we have Senator Joseph McCarthy. Levittown and the boom generation. During the 1950s, great social changes were underway in America. There was a spread of huge suburban housing tracts like Levittown, New York. Millions of young married couples were starting families in the years after World War II in America, and their children would become known as the baby boom generation. It's important to note that the GI Bill that was passed during World War II impacted a significant number of veterans of World War II in the post-war era, as they were able to come home, buy homes, go to college, and build a life for their families. Some scrutinized the growth of suburbia, but many families saw life in the suburbs as the next big step toward the American dream. Tragically, though, this also led to continued segregation of American neighborhoods, and it opened up the door for what became known as redlining in America, that limited the rights of African Americans, Latinos, and other minorities from receiving equal housing and equal services, not only provided by the government, but also provided in the private sector. Here we have the suburban sprawl of Levittown, New York, in the post-World War II era. Corporate America in the 1950s. The workplace changed in big ways during the 1950s. In the post-World War II era, the white-collar worker became much more commonplace as big corporations continued to grow as a result of the post-World War II prosperity, not only in economic growth for manufactured goods, but also for the advancement of technology. Companies like IBM, General Motors, and AT&T produced and managed a vast expansion of the wealth in America. The hard times of the Depression and World War II were over, and a keeping up with the Joneses type of mentality became the suburban mentality in the post-war era. This became sort of an era that was referred to as conformity during that post-World War II era. It must also be noted that economic growth and the rise of labor unions in the post-war era helped expand the American middle class throughout the United States, most notably in areas of urban and suburban growth because of manufacturing centers. Cities like New York, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago, and also major cities on the West Coast, like Los Angeles and San Francisco, San Diego, Midwestern and Western cities, Denver, and the like. Mad Men, AMC show, sort of deals with the advertising and the growth of corporate America in the 50s and 60s. Civil rights in the 1950s. African Americans continued to live under Jim Crow laws across the country in the 1950s. America continued to allow racial discrimination in every facet of American society, despite the fact that the color barrier had been broken by Jackie Robinson in Major League Baseball in 1947. African Americans were still struggling to receive any sort of equality and any type of justice in the courts in any locality or state during this era. Victories came in the form of court cases like Brown versus the Board of Education, and of course the Davis case here in Virginia. And a lot of this was obviously done through nonviolent protest. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as a young leader who led the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and energized the leadership of the Civil Rights era. He preached protest with nonviolence. Here on the left, we have Jackie Robinson, who was signed by Branch Rickey with the Brooklyn Dodgers. And on the right, we have Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., president and leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Scientific and medical advances. UNIVAC was America's early digital computer made for business use in the 1950s. However, that system would not have been able to be developed without the technological advancements that came out of World War II. Electric pacemakers were developed, and there were major advancements in heart surgeries. A vaccine to stop polio was developed by Dr. Jonas Salk, who's a doctor at NYU. The launch of the Russian satellite Sputnik became the first satellite launched into space, which caused embarrassment in America, and Sputnik truly ramped up the American and Soviet space race. And further, it intensified the American-Soviet rivalry, everything from nuclear warfare or the potential of nuclear warfare to espionage. Here we have Dr. Jonas Salk with the revolutionary development of the polio vaccine. And here we have the Soviet satellite Sputnik. The space race. American schools beefed up instruction in math and science, and education became a larger American priority, but not for all, because African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans and other minorities were still limited when it came to American education and American public education and funding in this era. The space race was on, alongside with a far more dangerous arms race with the development of the H-bomb. The hydrogen bomb was a frightening new atomic weapon, and the Soviets and the Chinese were testing them in the 1950s. The development of the intercontinental ballistic missiles was also a national concern. Here we have a Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile. Entertainment in the 1950s. The main entertainer in the 1950s was the television. Yet again, post-World War II allowed for a television to be in nearly every home. It became the source of the creative medium, but it also became criticized as a vast wasteland of mediocre programs. Rock and roll and rhythm and blues music became very popular, and the first of the boomers, when they hit their teenage years, became infatuated and obsessed with these new music genre. The genre's best-known performers were the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, and the king of the jukebox, Louis Jordan. Elvis Presley on the left, Louis Jordan on the right, and this is going to open up the door for rock and roll record producers like Sun Records and rhythm and blues R&B record producers like Motown. JFK in the 1960s. The 1960s began with two major issues: containment of communism and civil rights, and John F. Kennedy, a Catholic Democrat, the first ever elected, was elected president in 1960. He defeated Republican Richard Nixon, who had been a leading member on the House on an American Activities Committee, HUAC, which sought to root out suspected communists, and he was also the former vice president under Dwight D. Eisenhower. Kennedy projected an image that appealed to young Americans. He was youthful, Harvard-educated, idealistic, and he was also a World War II veteran. The Kennedy family became better known as Camelot. JFK called on Americans to pursue causes like racial equality and world peace. Ask not what you can do for your country was the most iconic line that came out of Kennedy's inauguration speech. John F. Kennedy, Jackie, John Jr., and Caroline, the Camelot family of America in the early 1960s. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba was JFK's first major Cold War problem and truly JFK's first major test as president. Fidel Castro led a successful communist revolution in Cuba in 1959. The CIA attempted to train Cuban exiles to overthrow the revolutionaries in the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, which was a totally botched plan, arguably JFK's greatest regret as president. The Soviets began to help the Cubans build nuclear missile launch pads in Cuba in 1962. In response, JFK ordered American ships to form a blockade around the island to prevent any new missiles from coming into the country. This put the ball in Russia's court, notably Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. There was widespread fear that the standoff would create and lead to nuclear war. In fact, this is as close as the America and the Soviets truly came to nuclear war. But the Russians backed down, and Khrushchev ultimately blinked, and the Soviets and Americans prevented a nuclear war from taking place in 1962. Here we have a Life magazine copy of the Bay of Pigs. This is a top secret CIA document that showed the range that the missiles could hit every major American city with the exception of Seattle, Washington. JFK and Vietnam. In more Cold War action, JFK visited Vietnam and decided to send a large number of military advisors and 8,000 troops to South Vietnam in 1961. JFK and the American government were sending continued support to South Vietnam in an attempt to stop the spread of communism in North Vietnam with their support of the President Ngo Dinh Diem. JFK was not the first president to prevent Vietnamese communism. Aid had been sent to the French by Eisenhower in 1954, and you can actually trace America's connection to Vietnam all the way back to the Truman administration, or the prevention of the spread of communism in Vietnam back to the Truman administration. This is an American soldier in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. The Kennedy Assassination. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed by a gunshot wound to the head while in a motorcade during a parade in Dallas, Texas. His killer was an ex-Marine, Lee Harvey Oswald. Before Oswald could be tried or even provide a motive, he was shot by known gangster Jack Ruby. The assassination remains shrouded in mystery. Vice President Lyndon B Johnson was sworn in as president on Air Force One. Here we have LBJ sworn in on Air Force One. The woman to his left, to our left, his right is his wife, Lady Bird Johnson, and the woman to his left and our right is John F. Kennedy's wife, Jackie Onassis Kennedy. LBJ and the Great Society. Lyndon B. Johnson was also concerned with civil rights and poverty in America. LBJ came from humble beginnings in Texas. He proposed that Americans fight, as he called, a war on poverty to build a great society. His proposals led to a widespread expansion of government social programs like welfare, Medicare, housing, government housing, education for the poor, and a number of other programs. The main laws were in the form of civil rights legislation, notably the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Here we have Lyndon B. Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law. And if you look behind him, you'll notice in attendance is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. All right, we're going to pump the brakes on Lesson 15. Please let me know if you guys have any questions. Thank you all so much for your time.